and welcome to another episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I am your host, Zachary Cook. Today we have another very unique guest. He hails from Aarhus, Denmark, nestled conveniently in the vibrant European Legacy scene known for its avid players and supporters. He has some impressive Legacy and Modern performances, including a Grand Prix Top 32 at GP Antwerp. He finished first at the Eternal Clash in Flensburg, and he won a Star City Games Legacy Open, which culminated in a Clash of Titans where he was able to take down the mighty Joe Lissette in the finals to claim his trophy. He streams on twitch.tv under the username _, where he can frequently be found playing Legacy Death and Taxes, and occasionally some other spicy brews. Through his Twitch streams, he has made quite a name for himself, and was our most requested guest for this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Marc Konig. Marc, welcome to Legacy's Allure.
Thank you very much, Zach, and hey guys.
All right, so you were requested to talk about Death and Taxes. This is the deck you're most certainly you are most known for playing, and probably the deck you've had the most success with, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so let's dig in. Tell us, what is Death and Taxes? Explain, how does this deck work? Where did it come from? And kind of what does it do?
Okay, so Death and Taxes is a prison control deck. It works by deploying lock piece after lock piece and eventually reducing the opponent's life total to 0 through these lock pieces that are usually creatures also. The deck was developed after Time Spiral came out when Mangara of Corondor was printed. And the interaction with Caracas and Mangara was like the backbone of the deck, and then other pieces were like Glow Rider and stuff were added. And when Flicker Wisp were printed, it was added to the deck pretty quickly too, and that made the Death and Taxes deck as it originally looked like.
Okay, so you mentioned that the deck really came into existence with the Time Spiral block, and I did a little research before this interview to sort of see the history of the deck, and it looks like there were some versions people were tinkering with prior to that, but they were tier 2 at best, I guess you could say. Not really legacy material yet. But with Mangara came the sort of the long-term lock piece, like you mentioned, where you had this late game plan that would ultimately just remove all of your opponent's options, and they could no longer compete really, because they would eventually just run out of land. So in Legacy, what does the Death and Taxes deck look like? What are some of the key spells, the key cards, and why are they important to the deck?
Okay, so determining key pieces in Death and Taxes is very hard because it's a highly synergistic deck, and you can point to all of the pieces as key pieces because they are all super powerful, high impact. And if you look at Edelweiss, you can say Edelweiss is a key piece that makes the deck work. It makes all the creatures super versatile, and it really is the engine behind the deck. But then if you look at Thalia, you can say, oh, but it taxes almost all spells in Legacy, and it's the backbone of the deck, and it's such a key piece and stuff. But generally, it just depends on the matchup, really. So all the cards are just so important, and they work with each other. So if you look at what can you say, like Stoneforge Mystic is so important because it applies pressure. Thalia is so important because it taxes their spells, and yeah. So I would just say that it's such a synergy deck, and each piece is so versatile and high impact that you can't really say what is the key piece.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that all these cards are so synergistic with each other and always high impact and versatile is really the strength of the deck.
Okay, so you've sort of alluded to it, but how does Death and Taxes win? Like, what is its the long-term game plan? Obviously, is to be somewhat the early game plan is to be somewhat disruptive, and like you mentioned with Thalia and so on, to make the game difficult for your opponent. But the actual winning strategy, or what is the ultimate plan that the deck will employ to finish a game off?
Well, that is the creatures, the luck pieces. It's about slowing your opponent down enough that your small creatures eventually gets there, and making sure they can't cast their spells and develop their game plan. Just slow them down enough until Phyrexian Revoker and Thalia is enough to kill them.
Okay, so we'll take a second here and discuss some of the. I would say there are some core pieces, the ones that you see in all versions of Death and Taxes, and then there are some other sort of interchangeable pieces. And like Mark has mentioned, all of these are creatures because the deck gets its strength, or a lot of its strength comes from the card Aether Vial, which requires you to have a lot of creatures in your deck to sort of get the benefit of its pseudo mana advantage. Probably the most well-known is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which is, like you mentioned, is the one that it's a 2/1 with first strike that increases the cost of non-creature spells by 1 colorless mana. So that makes most of the spells in Legacy cost twice as much as they normally do, because Legacy is sort of defined by its 1 mana spells, most notably the cantrips, Ponder, Brainstorm, and some of the cheap removal like Swords to Plowshares or Lightning Bolt. And then another creature you mentioned that is pretty much a 4 of in almost all lists is the Flicker Wisp, because it is the most, I would say at 3 mana, it's one of the most versatile creatures in the deck, right? It's a 3/1 with flying that when it enters the battlefield, it will exile another permanent that can include lands. It's any permanent from the battlefield, and then at the end of the turn, it returns. So the two of those combined create sort of the initial disruption package that you'll see in all of the decks. And then you have some more interchangeable pieces like Phyrexian Revoker in some numbers to sort of shut off activated abilities from permanents, things like Deathrite Shaman or Lion's Eye Diamond or those kind of things. And then there's usually a handful of other, I would say, more offensive threats, things like Sarah Avenger or Miran Crusader, that they have their own benefits, but they're not quite as disruptive. They're more like the powerhouse creatures that can really push through a lot of damage, or they have their own form of evasion in either flying or protection from black and green that allows the deck to utilize all of its equipment. Now, while we're on the topic of the equipment, another card that I think made a huge impact on the deck is Stoneforge Mystic. So would you care to explain the previous iterations of the deck before Stoneforge Mystic and what they had to do, because they still ran equipment, but how Stoneforge changed the sort of the groundwork for the equipment in the deck?
Well, the Stoneforge Mystic made it so that you had a threat that could really you could really grind. So you could start grinding with Stoneforge Mystic, and eventually Battleskull got printed, and that really was the huge push to make the grind plan viable, because now every single with the swords and with Sword of Fire and Ice and with Jitter, every creature is a huge threat, and with the Battleskull you can grind against all the decks, all the aggro decks. You can gain life and yeah. So my point is just that it made the grind plan more than viable. It made it one of the primary game plans, and the importance of the equipments are really that you have these small creatures like Phyrexian Revoker, and you have Thalia, and you have small flyers. I mean, Flicker Wisp is kind of big in Legacy with 3 power, but it is not much compared to some of the cheaty creatures. But it made it so that you have all these small creatures are suddenly huge threats with these equipments, and that's what Stoneforge Mystic really added to the deck. It was a really, really good card to include in the deck that changed the viability of the grind game plan.
Yeah, and another thing I've sort of noticed, because I have recently built and started playing Death and Taxes some myself, just at smaller events, and I've noticed that because when you play Death and Taxes, you're going against the Legacy norm. You're not playing a blue deck, so you don't have some of the inherent card selection or card quality, I'll say, because very few of the decks have card advantage, strict card advantage. But you do with blue decks, you have more card selection and card quality. So you need your limited number of tutor type effects to be incredibly powerful if you're not going to play blue. And I think Stoneforge Mystic is probably one of the the best examples of a tutor effect like that that's been printed in years that really showcases that kind of power. Like it's tutor when it searches for an equipment card, all of those equipment are backbreaking depending on the matchup, whether it be Sword of Fire and Ice for small creature decks. I'm sorry, Sword of Fire and Ice is for like control decks against decks like Miracles. Jite against the small creature decks, and Batter Skull against sort of the other grindy mid-range deck, like the rock decks, the black-green decks. Mm-hmm. So, are there variants on Death and Taxes? I know I've seen some that splash red. So, would you explain like what different versions of the deck exist, and why do those exist? Like, what are the differences in cards, and why are those cards different? What effects or what matchups are they for?
Okay, so the different iterations of Death and Taxes that arose in the last year probably is they all try to fix some glaring weakness to Death and Taxes. Like the green deck was trying to, well, it really depends on your point of view actually, because the green deck was supposedly trying to fix it was trying to fix a lot of things at once. The green splash, it was trying to make the Miracles matchup very lopsided. A lot of people have problems with the Miracles matchup,
Mm-hmm.
and the Galactique and Choke and stuff made that a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
And it was trying to fix the Dig Through Time matchup. So you add Galactique, then Dig Through Time is not viable. But it was trying to do too many things, I think, and it was not doing the things it was trying to do effectively enough. But the red splash was, at the time, there was I think that still Treasure Cruise was legal, and Infect, definitely Infect was on the rise. It was suddenly super popular because of Tom Russ, and then a few other decks were annoying. Like Elves was really popular too, despite having a terrible matchup against Miracles that was really popular, and not having the greatest Treasure Cruise Red Delver matchup. It was still very popular. And so what I tried to do, I tried to fix all these matchups at once. So I put some Flutter Strands and Wisps of Teeth in, and I put Plateau and Magus of the Moon. And then I added, for the sideboard, I added Sudden Demise, which was supposed to completely fix the Elves matchup, because I could take out the bad cards, the low impact cards, and then I have a super high impact card, and I have the other pieces. Like sometimes you're not drawing Cheetah, okay, then you're totally dead. No, not this time, because you can draw Sudden Demise as well, and that's enough to extend the game to the point where you can kill them with whatever, Flyers or Cheetah. And so the red splash was also for Infect, because Blood Moon is so good against Infect. They have one forest and they shut down Igmar's Nexus, and if they don't find the forest, they can cast Invigorate, and so on and so on. So it was supposed to make that matchup really lopsided. Then some people tried Black Splash as well for Orsa Pontiff to something against Young Pyromancer and for the Mirror. And people even tried Blue Splash for Meddling Mage, and I think some people even played True Nemesis. But this is very niche and very like obscure, I would almost say. So people just started trying all the splashes, and I think the green and red splash was pretty promising at some points, and they are both viable, I would say, definitely. But in my opinion, the most viable splash is red splash at the moment, especially because bug decks are really good, and the matchup against Miracles gets really fixed by Imperial Recruiter. So what I was trying to do was, I started when I was in Flensburg for the Eternal Clash, and I added just 4 Mags of the Moon, and then I went to the source, posted it, and asked for opinions, and someone suggested Imperial Recruiter, and I dismissed that immediately because it's too slow and it's not high impact enough. 3 mana for 1/1, even though the tutor effect is strong. But eventually I tried it anyway, and it was just so strong. The tutor effect was unbelievable, and even the 1/1 was fine because it carried Sword of Fire and Ice and Jita. Yep. So suddenly, with 2 Imperial Recruiters, you have an excellent Miracles matchup, because every time the Terminus, you just, if you have an Imperial Recruiter, you can put that in and then get another Imperial Recruiter, and then you have a loop. You never run out of creatures.
Yeah, and as long as you've got an equipment, then like we mentioned earlier, every single creature's a threat when you have equipment to put on them.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, that was just there's so many iterations now, and I think each one is viable in its own way. It just depends on what you're trying to beat.
Okay. So yeah, so like I said, the most common one I've seen is the red splash, which I guess you've somewhat pioneered then. And I have never had a chance to play against it in paper Magic, but it does, at least on paper, like you mentioned, it does look a lot stronger against some of the biggest weaknesses, both the elves and infect matchups, where they're sort of ignoring a lot of the normal disruption that Death and Taxes brings to the match. Like the mana disruption's hard to do, especially against elves where they have all creatures and it doesn't really affect them at all. And then not having a sufficient amount of removal against both of them would really be fixed, I would think, too, by the sudden demise.
Yes.
So, like we said, you've done some pioneering. Obviously, you've put a lot of time and effort into Death and Taxes. So, why do you choose to play Death and Taxes, and what makes it appeal to you?
Well, I'm not totally sure what makes it appeal to me. I think maybe it's because it offers a lot of variations in the games, because you have so many game plans you can adopt now that is viable. You can do like all-in disruption, aggro wasteland. You can grind with Stoneforge Mystic, Flicker Wisp. You can just there's so many angles you can attack on,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it so you have so many options. And I guess it's because I just never run out of new ideas to try and new approaches to games. So it's always fresh for me. And I guess it's true for a lot of legacy decks that there are different ways. There's a lot of different ways to play it, but I find it's especially true for different decks.
Yeah, and this, in doing all these interviews, all of my guests are sort of masters of their craft. They have put in, literally hundreds or thousands of games with the deck that they're known for, and they all sort of have a similar opinion, is that they feel when they're playing it, it gives them the power. Like they have the option to make all the decisions that they like. They can tinker with it however they want to. And it becomes a very personal sort of extension of you. It's how you play Legacy, right? It's not just a format that you play in. It's a deck, and it's a representation of yourself that's sort of symbolic of your legacy, or your version of it. And
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that's really cool. I think you don't see very much of that outside of Legacy. People don't get near as attached to their decks or put that kind of time into them, and I think that's amongst all the other things that make Legacy unique, that's probably one of the most special, is that you get to be so personal and intimate with the deck you like to play, and it's good to hear that a lot of people think that way as well. Other grinders and longtime players. So
Yeah.
what decks is Death and Taxes best against? What are its strong points?
So I think the strong points is that it's so versatile. Like it can attack on different angles. But it's not actually. I'm sorry. It's not about attacking. It's about the way you disrupt. The disruption package can do a lot of different things, and you always have something you can disrupt in some way. Like Correction Revoker against Sneak and Show, you can take Sneak Attack out of the equation, and it's super effective.
Mhm.
And if you're playing against Miracles, which is a vastly different deck, then you can take out Tensis Divining Top or Jace, which is both extremely high impact cards that you take out all of a sudden.
Mhm.
And but strong matchups, it's decks where the main game plan is already built. So for example, we should look at Merfolk. The main game plan of Merfolk is to play lots of guys, and they are unblockable, and they get huge by the numbers. Each number that makes the body larger and makes it
Mhm.
more powerful. But they're not unblockable against Death and Taxes, and they're not larger than Batterskull until Umesawa's Jitter or Sword of Fire and Ice begins to remove them. So it's just so ineffective already. You don't even have to start doing tricks with Flicker Wisp. You don't have Thalia is not very effective. The first strike is nice, but it doesn't do anything besides that,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't even need that because their game plan is just so incredibly weak. And if you look at goblins, it's the same, entirely ineffective, but first strike nice, of course, because they're small guys,
Mm-hmm.
and but you don't tax them. But the equipment is just so good, and so I guess the best matchups are the matchups where Better Skull and the equipment is just incredibly good right from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like any deck that doesn't have much disruption, much way to disrupt your game plan. And I mean that's probably sort of a generic statement in Legacy. If they can't disrupt your game plan, you're going to be good against them. But in this case, they literally cannot even begin to fight back, because most decks that if they don't have a way to either ignore or deal with the Jite, then they will just lose to it. There is no coming back from that. Like, you either have to be playing a deck where it doesn't matter, like if you're playing, I don't know, something like Reanimator, although Reanimator is still a good matchup for Death and Taxes, but that's a deck, for example, that can just ignore equipment because the creatures are enormous and they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have to be one that can actually just deal with the equipment, and those are so few and far between, because who plays main deck Artifact Hate for the most part? I mean, you got maybe the bug decks, but but that's about it.
Yeah, but then you have other cards like Mirror Crusader that are complete haymakers and just crush them.
You've always got an answer, and I find that that's the strength that playing Death and Taxes. That's sort of the strength I've noticed too, is that you're very malleable. Your disruptive elements are good against virtually all opponents. There's always some disruptive piece that's good against somebody. Now you still have to draw them, but that's magic. You have to draw it. And the best decks to play against are the ones that are where you're firing on all cylinders. They need their cantrips, they need their creatures, and they need their like tempo elements to play out. So matchups like the Delver decks, a lot of those, especially some of the older variants of Delver, like the Bug Delvers or the Teamer Delver, those matchups always feel really strong, because like it's just like every element of their deck is matched by a better element of yours.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good point.
So if Delver decks and creature and those kind of creature decks are your good matchups, what is Death and Taxes' bad matchups, and where does it fall short? What are its weaknesses?
So the weaknesses are there's very few weaknesses. I think that most matchups are very good, but the weaknesses are the very strong sideboard cards. It's because there's so many X1s, so many small creatures, and if the opponent overloads on removal, I mean stacks up on cheap removal and or mass removal, then it can be really hard. So playing against Punishing Fire can be really hard. So Jund is not a good matchup. Or if the disruption pack is actually not very effective, which there's only really one deck where it's not. First of all, it's a combo deck, so it's not the best matchup. Like, you get Reanimate and Sneaky Show, that's awesome matchups, but the other combo decks are really not that great matchups. And it's a combo deck, and it has creatures just, so that's just recipe for disaster for my deck.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so it's just, and they play a couple of creatures, you don't have lots of removal, and then they play a natural aura and you're done. So Elves and Jund, is the number one decks I would name, number 1 and 2 decks I would name as for weak matchups. And just other than that, weaknesses is mass removal and hate cards. It's just so brutal to get your board erased with a Golgai Charm, or to face a turn 1 Dread of Night.
Right. So the decks that sideboard well, or that plan to sideboard heavily against it, obviously can be tough. And then you said creature-based combo, so elves. What about like a deck like Infect, which is essentially sort of a creature-based combo deck too? I don't imagine that's as bad as elves, but in my experience, Death and Taxes is, because I play Infect primarily. Death and Taxes has always felt like an easier matchup than a lot of the others.
Yes, well, the problem is we have 4 pieces of removal, and that's simply not enough against these 12 creatures that are all so good against us. Because the Glistener Elf comes down on turn 1, that's a huge problem. The Blight Agent is unblockable, that's a huge problem. And the Ingoth Ingmar Nexus is the easiest to deal with because it's hit by Wasteland and Schadenport, but it's still it dodges. It's a creature that cannot be removed at sorcery speed, which
Yep.
is a problem because you cannot if you can play in a way that makes it so that you can use your removal on your turn, and then your opponent cannot really do anything. But essentially, Ingmar Nexus is completely protected from Source to Plowshares on the Death and Taxes player's turn, which is also a problem. So the 12 creatures, the three different creatures in the deck, they are all super problematic in their own way. And then on top of that, you have permission, and you have cantrips to make it consistent, and you have answers and bomb spells or creatures, whatever you need. And so it makes it the matchup very hard, except if you have access to hate cards like Magus of the Moon.
Yeah. Yeah, and you were right earlier. Blood Moon is a very good card against Infect. The only I default to fetching the basic forest almost instinctively now, just because I mean I can handle getting wastelanded, but I can't handle this having all of my future lands locked out by a Blood Moon.
Yes.
So okay, so if you're playing one of the decks that has a bad Death and Taxes matchup, what should you sideboard to improve the matchup? What are good hate cards to bring in against Death and Taxes?
Well, it depends on which colors you have access to. But Nullrod is always a good one. All colors have access to Nullrod. But the problem is that for some decks, they use artifacts themselves, so they don't want to sideboard Nullrod because it would be too narrow then and not effective enough. But if you have black, it's obvious to go with Dread Knight, and if you have access to green as well, you get the versatile card Golgai Charm. And if you just want something versatile as removal, Disfigure is also super good. And yeah, so it all depends on how all in you want to go on actually just having a great post sideboard matchup against Death and Taxes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in general, you want to fight the most powerful aspects of the deck, and that is its small disruptive creatures. And like we mentioned, those are things like Thalia, the Phyrexian Revoker. In some cases, you'll see things like Aethersworn Canonist, some of those types of creatures that really limit your options. They're all somewhat susceptible to sweepers and sort of like you mentioned, Dread of Night, the -1/-1 effects, which normally wouldn't seem like a super powerful effect, but against a deck that's just chock full of X1s, it can be really strong. And same thing with Golgari Charm. That's sort of a wrath, a one-sided wrath against Death and Taxes most times. And then the card that you mentioned earlier, Nullrod, we actually haven't had, for some reason, haven't had that one on any of the interviews yet. But that's a really common sideboard card in Legacy. One or sometimes two of them in the sideboards of decks that can run it. That it's a 2-mana artifact that basically says you can't use artifacts. Like, it shuts off all of their activated abilities. And unlike it's an older design, so unlike the newer designs where it would still probably allow mana abilities, Nullrod simply shuts them all off. So any deck that can afford to run that, like that needs no activated abilities of artifacts of its own, it's probably the biggest haymaker against the primary game plan being the equipment and Aether Vial. So yeah, that one makes sense as a very very good hate piece that has very low opportunity cost. You're not really risking hurting yourself at all by playing a card like Nullrod if you don't have any artifacts.
Yes.
So we'll assume that your opponent brings in those kind of hate pieces, or they've prepped for the matchup. Does Death and Taxes have sideboard cards to sort of do the next level sideboarding? Do you have to fight back against the hate that people will bring in against you, or is Death and Taxes more of a sideboard to beat its opponent's deck?
Well, I like to have a few answers for these hate cards. I like to play Countless Judgment in the sideboard because it's so versatile. You can get rid of Planeswalkers and you can get rid of hate cards. You can do anything. But the downside to it is it's just so expensive, and it's sorcery, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to have a few copies of them, and other than that, you have to kind of hope, or you have to play well enough or in the right way, I should say, to play around as much of these sideboard cards as possible, because it's gonna be rare that you lose to these sideboard cards in reality if you play the matchups right, if you play the games right. And but as I mentioned, I can get rid of Null Rod or Dread of Night with Council's Judgment. But other than that, you can sometimes use Flicker Wisp to get rid of these hate cards for a turn and really change the game in that way. For example, you can equip your Sword of Fire and Ice if you just Flicker Wisp an Null Rod, and then it doesn't affect the Sword of Fire and Ice afterwards if it's already equipped to a creature. And maybe you just need one hit with a Jitter, one or two activations to seal the game, or you need to equip the Battle Skull. Whatever, you can usually rely on Flicker Wisp to like negate some of the effect of these hate cards, or save an important creature from a Gogai Charm, whatever you need. So my point is just, if you play the right way, then these hate cards will not be as effective as they would otherwise be.
Now, I know I've seen some players trying to fight back against the hate cards with things like Wiltleaf Liege or Veteran Armor, or some sort of the Anthem effects. I haven't tried it myself, but I feel like that may be a bit too cute, like you're going a little too deep there. What are your thoughts on effects like that and trying to like next level the hate in that way?
Well, I think the best way to next level the hate, I think it starts in deck building. I think it starts in not overloading on X1s, and well, basically that's it. The only way people fight Death and Taxes is with creature-based hate, and I mean, like, Dread of Night or removal. Right. They fight on the creature axis, which is the only axis you can really fight it on, or the equipment axis, which is the next one, which is not as effective, but with Null Rod it can be the game changer. But I think it starts in deck building, and that's the reason I don't run for what's it called, the Pegasus,
Vryn Wingmare.
Exactly. That's the reason I've been avoiding that, for example, because if you start cutting Mirran Crusader or Zero Avenger for Vryn Wingmare, then suddenly you have so many X1s, and it's just way more devastating. I think there was definitely this SGG grinder who got completely destroyed in several games, maybe in a row, playing for top 8 in a tournament, because he had 4 Wingman. Maybe they brought him to the point where he was able to play these matches, but it definitely cost him the chance to play for top 8, because he got completely destroyed by these 8 cards, because he left himself so vulnerable to them.
Right.
In deck building.
Yeah, and there was a lot of talk about Vryn Wingmare when it came out, because it's essentially an upgraded Glow Rider, right? It's the same effect as Thalia, but it has flying, which is huge, because evasion sort of defines the offensive portion of Death and Taxes. If outside of the equipment, the creatures that can do the most attacking are the ones that can that fly, because like you mentioned earlier, a lot of your disruptive ground-based creatures like Thalia and Revoker, as soon as the opponent has even a Deathrite Shaman, well, Thalia is all right, but Deathrite Shaman alone is enough to hold back a Phyrexian Revoker in most cases, because you just don't want to lose the effect. It has a body, but it's somewhat irrelevant in a lot of cases, because you can't risk losing it. But yeah, I noticed the same thing, that even though Vryn Wingmare has evasion and an effect you want, that one toughness makes it such a liability for the opponents who are ready. Now, you get into the matchups, and I think part of the reason that he was so heavy on the Wingmares in that build was it was during the dig through time era where everyone wanted to play 12 or more cantrips, and it was just brutal against that kind of a deck. That it was really effective when you got paired up against Omnitel or Storm or something like that. But you're right, the prepared opponent would then just devastate you with Dread of Night or Massacre or something like that. So, in your recommendation, or in your opinion, why should someone say they're new to Legacy and they're trying to pick a deck? Why should they consider Death and Taxes? And what type of player then do you recommend the deck to?
Well, I would recommend it to to a player that's very dedicated to learning the format if they don't already know it, because it takes a lot of knowledge of the format to play this deck, because it's such a reactive deck. It's all about your opponent's game plan. It's not about your own. It's all about uh, finding holes and ways to fight your and disrupt your opponent's game plan. So it's really, really important that you're knowledgeable about all the decks in Legacy. So you need to know what to name with Friction Revoker, and you need to know what to save Legos for, etc. So I recommend it for the really dedicated Legacy player who's looking for a creature-based deck that does it all, basically.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's funny. I've talked with my friends a bunch about Death and Taxes while I was building it, and saying I really wanted to try this out. I think it's really awesome and really cute at the same time that a White Weenie deck exists in the format known for, turn 2 kills or potential turn 2 kills and all that kind of thing. And you think, well, how can a deck like that even begin to compete? All these little 1 and 2 mana white creatures. And I think it primarily has to do with the nature of the format, right? That they are, the deck exists because of Legacy's metagame, not because the game plan is inherently strong. Like as soon as you get paired up against a deck like Nick Fit or something that brings 4 mana creatures to the table, you really start to struggle. But the fact that everyone wants to run like cantrips and really cheap creatures like Delver's Secrets makes even more importantly with Karakas, lots of legendary creatures as win conditions. That everything about the deck is sort of like it exists because of what Legacy is as a metagame. It sort of fits in all the cracks that these decks leave that would normally just go ignored or unexploited. And I just think that's really awesome. And I wanted to say that before we moved on, that like it can exist because of the way Legacy is, not because it is inherently a super strong deck. Like it is dependent on the decks around it being what they are. And I mean, that's true of most control decks, right? Like you build them to fight the expected metagame. It's just Death and Taxes does it in a very, very unique way. Mm-hmm. So now you mentioned that a player should be very dedicated to learning the Legacy format in order to play this deck well. Do you think that there is a high skill barrier to learning the deck and playing it well? And should that play into a person's decision to pick up the deck?
Well, it all depends on what your ambitions. What do you expect when you pick up the deck? Do you expect to win a huge percent of your matches and always get the opportunity and take the opportunity to outplay your opponent and win the game that way? Or do you just want to have fun with a different deck than the Delver decks or whatever? Mm-hmm. I would recommend it to a lot of people, but it's so cool, I would say, because there's so many tricks and you can play without knowing all these tricks and still win games. But it's just so it offers so much. The skill ceiling is so high for the deck. So yeah, I would just if you like this play style, then I would recommend it to you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there are some decks in Legacy that are extremely blunt force. The best example is things like Reanimator or Sneak and Show, where like what you're doing is really obvious. It's very, very powerful, and it's just sort of blunt. Like there is no real backup. There is no I won't say it doesn't take skill, because it does take skill. Any deck that runs Brainstorm takes skill, but it's not once you've gotten good at it, I don't feel like it's as thought provoking anymore. Like your game plan and your lines are pretty set in stone. And a deck like Death and Taxes or I just did an interview on Infect. I feel like those decks and some of the Delver decks too, they give you a lot of room to find solutions and do the sort of the puzzle solving game or sub game of Magic, which is I find very appealing, and it is that makes it difficult, but that also makes it rewarding.
Absolutely.
So tell us, you've played the deck for a pretty long time now. Tell us about one or two of your favorite moments playing Death and Taxes. What was happening? How did it happen? And why is it special to you?
Okay, so I would probably point to my number one most special moment, or what you want to say, with Death in Texas is probably the CG finals where my opponent went to flip top to draw a card in my turn when I attacked, and after the miracle trigger, after I got priority from the miracle, well, I get priority immediately from the miracle trigger since I'm an active player. So in response to the miracle trigger, I activated Elder Violin, put in Thalia, making the terminus cost one more. And when the miracle trigger is resolved and he gets to cast it, there was not enough mana to cast it, so it was stuck in his hand. And that way, it's the one that's quoted to me always when people mention they watched the match, and just denying my opponent from casting the sweeper there just won the game on the spot. So yeah, and then I always have these moments of I have countless moments of viling in a Magus of the Moon where there was no signs I'm playing anything other than mono white, and having them seeing the look of despair in their face after they go from a winnable match to being completely destroyed, and that's always priceless.
I'm sure that, I bet that makes some of the Shardless Sultai and the Jund players just lose all hope when they've fetched out all these dual lands and they've got their Grove of the Burn Willows, and then suddenly they have nothing, just a pile of mountains.
Especially when it comes out from Eldervile, they're like, "Oh, but I would like to have responded," and then
I'm sure you would.
Okay, to the trigger. It's late, man. You're done.
Yeah. So that story you told about the finals in Richmond, I don't know. I don't remember. I've watched the videos a few times, but I was there. I may actually be in the background of that video. I was watching because you were there with a few of your friends. Post that was after Grand Prix New Jersey, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I remember watching. You played lands and then something else, and then Joe Lisette in the finals, and I remember watching it and thinking, I knew, when you started to tell the story, I knew exactly what you were going to talk about, and that moment was really awesome. I think that was a perfect example of what you were talking about with how complex and the nuance of the deck can really just give you the huge advantage, because I don't know if Joe saw it coming, but he certainly felt the aftermath when it happened. Yes. Like it was a duh moment or whatever, whenever it finally happened. So,
yeah.
Anyway, you are credited, or at least people have told me that you are one of the first major streamers of legacy content. I guess when Twitch.tv got really big with MTGO streamed content, and legacy became very popular on MTGO, and plenty of the people that know of you, I think, know of you just from that alone. So explain to me, how has building a career as a Twitch streamer affected your development as a Magic player, both professionally and personally?
Well, first of all, it has made me a much better player, because I've just gotten to play a lot of Magic, and I've had a lot of critical eyes on me all the time saying, "Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Wasn't it better to do this?" And that helps a lot. If you're not the best player in the world, then it will always help you. Okay, and then it has made me a lot more critical of my own playstyle, because when people suggest these different lines all the time, you sit hour after hour streaming, and every minute there's someone who suggests an alternate line, and you have to go through, why was this line not better, or is it better, and why is it better? So it has helped me be a lot more critical about my own playstyle and try different things, and that helps a lot with making the right play when it eventually matters. And then Twitch and streaming has helped me build a lot of great friendships that has helped me whenever I travel for even non-MTG related things. I've met up with people I know through streaming, and it has just always been a great experience. And at every tournament, I've met viewers, and I've met just all these people I know through it, and it's always so great. So that has been a huge plus by streaming as well.
You feel that playing all those games and all that we'll say criticism, or having all the scrutiny on your game has made you a better paper Magic player as well, like at the bigger events like Grand Prix and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. It just improves my playstyle overall. I mean, my game overall, and it also helps a lot. Playing online also helps a lot with just managing your game when you play, because there's one dimension to playing is simply just trying to outplay your opponent on the strategic level, but another, what can I say, maybe sub game or just another dimension is keeping track of all the rules, keeping track of all the triggers. And even though online everything is reminded to you, it remembers everything, then it adds a lot to remembering these triggers, because when you play in paper, then you will just be a lot more aware of all these things going on. And for example,
Hmm.
I never miss triggers in paper. I don't put a dice on top of my library to remember triggers. It's just automatic because I've played so much on Magic Online. I can't explain why, but it just helps this way, and I don't miss my own taxing effects. But my opponents, they miss them almost every single game where Thalia is involved. Someone misses paying extra for Thalia, and of course they will have to get a warning from a judge from that. So it's detrimental to their what do you say, like, results at the GP, maybe
Hmm.
potentially.
Yeah, and also I mean, it's got to be sort of an advantage in a way that like an opponent who doesn't have that kind of experience online with online play is going to sculpt their game plan under an assumption that's just wrong. Like and they would know that playing online, they would get a feel for that and do it correctly. But when they don't have that experience, right, they're gonna try and they're gonna set up a turn where they think, all right, I'll cast this ponder, then I'll have the 2 mana to cast my Tarmogoyf. but
Yes.
but they've screwed the whole thing up. In their head it works out, and then when you point it out to them, the everything crumbles, and a lot of people will get frustrated, or they won't be able to respond
Right.
quickly enough to come up with a new plan. And that's when mistakes happen, and that's how you capitalize and win, is just take advantage of
Yes.
your opponent.
People who tilt from. I mean, it's not something about you personally when you're playing against someone, but sometimes they just people just tilt, and they tilt from making mistakes, and it just snowballs. And
Hmm.
it doesn't matter who you are, if you haven't developed the, I don't know, something to deal with this tilt, to deal with getting past these mistakes, then it's gonna hunt you, and it's gonna, I mean, haunt you, and it's gonna make you play worse, and it's
Yep.
a lot of the time it's gonna cost you the game. So it's definitely an important thing to learn from Magic Online.
So one last question, before we go. What would you recommend to, because you've done so much online play, to a less experienced player, someone who's new and trying to improve their game, and let's especially focus on, with regards to legacy and sort of the depth of that format?
I would say simply just play a lot, get the experience, and I would also say try different things, because usually your approach is not the only one, and even if there's a strictly right approach, it's very hard to reach that without trying things. So basically, what I'm saying is keep an open mind when it comes to taking different lines. Uh, and uh, there was one more thing. Uh, yeah, surround yourself with people that are better than you. Try to surround yourself with people who want to be better and who are good at the game. Obviously, everyone can't be surrounded by people who are better than themselves, but people are willing to teach things. So
Hmm.
just get into an environment where you can develop yourself as a player, where you can learn, where you can grow as a player.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, the you have to put in the reps. You have to get a feel for it. And one thing you said that I really want to harp on, or push on, is that, there's this sort of mentality or theory sometimes in Magic, that there is a strictly correct, or an always better or best way to play. And I think people get that impression because they see a certain line taken 90% of the time. But I feel that that's a fallacy. That statement is inherently wrong. Like, you cannot have a best line every time without perfect information first. And Magic is a game of imperfect information. Even if you know all of a player's hand and their board state and their graveyard and everything, you still don't know what their next draw step is. There's something hidden, and the assumption that you can perfect your play to the point where you're always making the absolutely right play or the right decision is a hurdle that some players have got to get over. You make the best decisions you can based on what you know, and some of them will seem better than others, but without the experience, you will never know, or you won't have that sort of gut feeling of, is this line better or not, and when isn't it, or when will it likely not be? And until you've done enough repetitions with a deck and really gotten yourself immersed in the format, you just don't know that. So play a lot of games and get a lot of experience, because that's how you get better.
Yes.
Anyway, Marc, it's been really fun talking with you. You're obviously have a great understanding of Death and Taxes, and you really appreciate the archetype for what it is. So I am very glad you have joined us. Thank you for taking time to share your knowledge and your experience.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies Allure. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page. Or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at the user MTG Training Grounds, and follow us on Twitter at @MTG_TRGrounds. I am Zachary Cook. Thank you for joining me.